David Guterson has written 7 books, and none of them sound alike. You're aware of Snow Falling on Cedars, which has sold over 4 million copies. It's a lot of books. It's been made into a major motion picture, which is another step up the ladder there, and received several prestigious awards, including the PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction. What you may not know is that his first collection was of short stories, and that his second book was a nonfiction book called Family Matters: Why Homeschooling Makes Sense. His other novels focused on diverse, important themes, and these are quite diverse: male friendship, the Oedipus Rex myth, and end-of-life issues. While this is not lighthearted, humorous writing, you will find it thought-provoking, and the description, thought-provoking and a great description, which is why Snow Falling on Cedars was chosen as the Whatcom READS book this year. It's always a pleasure to read an author who is from our own community, because you can recognize places and names. And David was born and raised in Seattle. His father was a criminal defense attorney, and he actually talked a lot about law at the dinner table and attended some trials and actually thought about being an attorney. His mom raised their 4 children, and David went to the University of Washington. When he was 21, he took a short story writing class. And I love this quote from his teacher. The teacher emphasized that stories really mattered, and that when people read stories, they are transfigured by them. David says that spoke to him, and one day when he was writing a short story in class, he found out that writing was fun. And isn't that wonderful to have an occupation, a profession, a passion that you love, that you get to do all the time? He completed his BA in English and then an FMA and got a teaching credential. He married his wife, Robin, and she gave birth to the first of their 4 children when they moved to a bungalow on Bainbridge Island, where they live now. And he taught English at Bainbridge High School for 12 years. He doesn't teach now, he writes. His day starts usually at 4 a.m., so 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. is the writing time. And he doesn't look tired to me, so maybe he slept in this morning. But the main thing that he just told me when we were sitting in the front row is that his daughter goes to Fairhaven College. So he also knows our community, and we're very happy to have him here sharing his story with us. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mayor, for your gracious introduction. I also enjoyed hearing about the vigor and vitality of Whatcom Community College. Thanks for sharing those comments. And it's true, my daughter does go to school here. She's a sophomore. And so over the last 2 years, I've had the good fortune to visit Bellingham numerous times and the opportunity to get to know it quite a bit better. And it is a lovely town, and we enjoy coming here. I look for any excuse to come up. It's a great place, and you're fortunate to live in Whatcom County. And as the mayor told you, as I was born in Seattle and grew up there, and then moved to Bainbridge Island after college. It put me in mind of something I remember from quite some years ago now, which is, I was named after my great-grandfather, whose name was David Taylor, and he was a tailor. And he had a shop in Seattle, and it said Taylor the Tailor on it. And his brother, for some reason that I don't quite understand, was also named David. Or maybe it was his cousin. I'm not quite sure the relationship. Anyway, my Uncle Dave, I remember him. He died at age 98. And I remember him telling me years ago that he had been living in Seattle at the time of the Great Seattle Fire, which I believe was 1889. And they lost everything, and they moved to what was then called Whatcom, which is here. was here for a year or two, and then came back to Seattle. And I guess at the time, Whatcom was a absolutely sort of thriving place that perhaps rivaled Seattle in significance. And at that point, Seattle had been decimated, and so Whatcom was a likely place for my great uncle to move to. We do have a long history as a family, going back 4 generations, 5 now with my children in the Seattle area, and I feel fortunate to live and work in this part of the country. Snow Falling on Cedars was published in 1994, which is now 19 years ago, and I was working on it over a long period of time prior to that. So for me, my experience of Snow Falling on Cedars as a part of my life now goes back, about 25 to 30 years. And if I'm honest, I have to say that my memory, in a specific way, of writing this book really isn't very good. And how memory works anyway. Memory is a curious thing, and it bears only a tenuous relationship to the actual past. Because you build on it, you tell yourself stories, those stories become real, and you forget what was real and what it is that you've made up. And after a while, you really don't know anything with any certainty any longer. I do know that I was a high school English teacher when I wrote Snow Falling on Cedars. That's where the 4 a.m. start came in. There's really no other way to get the book written than to get up early and put in some time before going off to school. Well, in preparation for this occasion, I went down to the basement and dug through old boxes, and I found my box of notes from having worked on Snow Falling on Cedars, and I opened that thing up, and inside, the sheaves in there had a lot of scrawlings on them from along the past, and they had yellowed a bit, and there were some journal entries and all kinds of notes and so on. And I looked at those, and I thought, well, now here's something definitive and trustworthy that really does place me back. This box is telling me the truth. Why does it seem so different from my memory? My memory really is sort of at odds with that loose, tattered record in the box there. And that set me to thinking a little bit more about that period and trying to retrieve some images of that era in my life. The bungalow that you mentioned was really a ramshackle place without central heating. And there was an upstairs room that was quiet that I could work in, but it had no heat. And there was a little alcove with a window. And I tucked the desk into that. And then I got some blankets and I nailed them up, sort of surrounding the desk, and I got a space heater and put that in there. I remember that. The other thing I remember is that at the time, the cutting-edge piece of technology for writers was something called a word processor with a display about that big, and the words would sort of flit across it ephemerally and then disappear. So I was able to conjure up a couple of memories of that nature. But again, I don't trust it. Because, as I said, memory is subject to serial revision and even to spontaneous fabrication. So I really have a problem here with knowing anything other than something tentative and provisional about this period in my life 25 to 30 years ago. I read somewhere that Tolstoy at 79 claimed to have completely forgotten his earlier work. And I wonder where I'm headed. I can imagine myself, coming across a text in a used bookstore and recognizing it as an artifact I'm responsible for, but having no memory of how it came into the world could happen. But so far, this is Snow Falling on Cedars as an era of my life, as events, as opposed to a product, as opposed to an object. As events, it's not entirely lost to me. I do remember some things. But those things are, I would describe them as sort of hues and tones, as colorations, a sense of mood, vestiges of my interior landscapes, so intimations of the thoughts and feelings that informed me at the time. I can sort of conjure up who I was in the moment. I have to tell you, it's not a pretty scene. Here I was, straddling 30 years of age, approximately, and looking back, I realized that I was somebody whose cup overflowed with terrible ambition, and also with terrible self-belief. I suffered a surfeit of romanticism, and I imagined writing a religious calling and myself a sort of monk. To put this another way, I guess I'm a white middle-class American male whose sense of destiny informed his every youthful breath. I remember a number of times at Suzzallo Library on the University of Washington campus getting impatient with waiting for the elevator and deciding that it was faster just to bound up the stairs. And to me, that's a metaphor for how I was. I didn't have time for anything to get in my way because I was determined to save the world. I had mania and I had heroism, and these things spurred me in equal measures. Nothing was going to stop me. I was going to save the world by writing things, and I was going to start that in my 20s with writing Snow Falling on Cedars. Now, you can call that an ethos or a sensibility or a temperament, or you could call it a bona fide clinical neurosis. But whatever you call it, I think it's evident in the novel, which I returned to and read recently. It's there in its characters, it's there in the plot, and it's in the atmosphere of the book, which, while languid, still does feel like a pressure cooker, one slowly building up the steam of moral force on every page. And when I think back on this, it makes sense. It makes sense to me because as a child, I'd been fed on, I'd been trained toward, and I'd been steeped in morality of the liberal American variety. It was the sort that I heard in the room when we were told that in the 80s, this habitat for bald eagles disappeared to make room for this building. I was raised that way. Yeah. I was raised on Horton Hatch's The Egg, The Adventures of Pinocchio, Old Yeller, The Red Pony, Shane, The Once and Future King, Where the Red Fern Grows. Yeah. This was a kind of pervasive inculcation that came from my education, my reading, my place and time, my family. Everything told me to have an American liberal vision, moral vision of life and of the world. And so what happened to me in my early 20s when I was starting to write was that this pervasive inculcation or indoctrination into a worldview and a moral sensibility, it met up with my forays as a budding writer. And a merger that was strengthened, as I recall, in 1978 when John Gardner published On Moral Fiction. I remember that this was a book that immediately offended nearly everyone except for me. That most of the people around me, my peers and colleagues who were writers, were ranting and raving about what was wrong with this book, and that a number of critics and academics were upset about this book. Meanwhile, I understood this guy, Gardner, is completely right about these innovators who'd risen to the top of American letters at the time. So this would be people like John Barth and Thomas Pynchon and Donald Barthelme and John Hawkes and William Gass. To me, like Gardner, I just felt that these people were just busy bamboozling us and that they were mesmerizing the critics. And like Gardner, I tended to side in my moral obsessiveness with Homer and Dante. And at the same time that this was going on for me, this was the era in which Raymond Carver was utterly ascendant as an influence on young American writers, particularly young white male American writers. And his stories, I was also subject to his spell. His stories hit me with the force of vindication, offering a kind of antidote to what was going on in American letters at the time that I objected to so profoundly. I felt that Carver's allegiance to convention and his minimalism, when they were matched head to head with the very precious elaborations and the rarefied gimmickry of the avant-garde, that Gardner and Carver really won hands down in terms of their emotional, psychological, social, and cultural meaning and impact. And so I was subject to these forces. And at the same time, I took a sort of romantic interest in what Carver was doing. This sort of dirty realism spoke to me. I found this vision of America in all of its sordidness quite romantic, and I think ultimately Carver was a romantic, and I was too, but not of the school of dirty realism. My own romanticism was more pastoral. I passed my youth in a city, Seattle, but nevertheless, or maybe even because of it, I was John Muirish when it came to mountains and forests. And in my fantasies, which were informed by an influential book of the period, Helen Scott Nearing's Living the Good Life, I simply looked forward as I got older and entered my young adulthood to rural and rustic simplicities. I figured that in the country, I'd live beyond the reach of the military industrial complex and of corporate capitalism. In other words, in territory consistent with my own purity. I imagined I might survive apocalypse by dint of my own handiwork. I think it's a bit ironic, given that view of things, that I ended up on Bainbridge Island, which is 35 minutes by ferry from Seattle and 30 from the Trident submarine base. Basically, I'm at ground zero. And I live in a place that's increasingly trendy and posh. I didn't really go where I thought I was going. But I know how this happened. I just, as a young person, blown my wad that I'd earned working summers for the Forest Service, brush disposal work, burning the slash and clear cuts. I'd used all that to go on a European romp in a Volkswagen van. So much for my moral presumption. Anyway, the money was gone. I had to resort to squatting in a trailer owned by friends who lived, that so happened, on Bainbridge. They needed to be somewhere else. The trailer was empty. I had no money, so I landed on Bainbridge, and I just lit up their wood stove and hoed up their garden and slept on a mattress thrown on the floor and went to town in a 67 Travelall, and none of that really seemed like Carver's dirty realism. It seemed to me, really, in my romanticism, like a kind of magical realism, because the island's woods, its fields, and its beaches were, for me, infused with rural mystery. And this is something that haunts Snow Falling on Cedars, with its layer on layer of natural description, its interest in weather and all things yeoman, in tackle and trim and agriculture, and in the mores and manner of island people. Most of that viewed and written through the gloss of a city boy's flirtation with salt of the earth living. I was newly ashore on a green and wet island, and I preferred ideas to reality, and I saw icons where there were human beings, and I gravitated toward scenes that confirmed my assumptions, and I translated the world according to my bent. That is, as an urban voyeur who'd moved to Mayberry of the Pacific. Do I loathe who I was? Or rather, to bring it back, do I loathe my own novel? No. But I have to say that I'm no longer on intimate or really even friendly terms with it, which is something Philip Roth said about his early work. I think that Snow Falling on Cedars is a novel not without merit. But again, borrowing from Roth, I think I'd be a mawkish and deluded parent if I were to feel toward it now all these years later, as I did in its darling infancy. I have to tell you that really, technically speaking, until recently, I hadn't read it. And I say that because there really is no clear line of demarcation between writing a novel and reading one. If you think about it, prior to the publication of the novel, I had read truncated versions, alternate versions, revisions of revisions, multiple iterations. I'd read manuscripts that had been marked up by relatives and friends and by an editor. I'd read manuscripts that had, with marginalia that had been scrawled by a number of experts who were kind enough to help me and who I named in my acknowledgments. I read galleys from a copy editor. I read what the proofreader had to say. And so the truth is, by the time this story became a book, I was just far too done with it to take an interest in what was between its covers. That's the truth. And really, I have to tell you that this sort of aversion to revisiting these pages with which I was already way too well acquainted, this went on until a month or two ago, when I began to come to grips with the fact that I was going to be standing here before too long. And that I needed to know something about this book that I had forgotten so much about. And so much water had crossed under the bridge in the meantime. I'd written all these other novels. Every molecule in my body had turned over. I was really somebody else completely. And I couldn't remember what this book was about or why I'd written it. And yet I had to come here and pretend. And I didn't want to pretend. I really didn't. I wanted, hopefully, to be of use to you instead of waste your time. And so I read the book. And before I read it, I pulled it off the shelf. It was a vintage edition, a paperback. I looked at the cover, which is thoroughly familiar to me, the trees and the waters and the mist. And up in the upper right corner, there was a decal, like a gold sphere, that identified this novel as the award-winning #1 bestseller. And then down in the lower left, there was a quote from the New York Times that said, "Compelling, heart-stopping, finely wrought, flawlessly written." This book in heft was neither daunting or lightweight. It looked sort of literary, but it didn't look too literary. On the back, I was told that it won the PEN/Faulkner Award and the American Booksellers Association Book of the Year Award. And I thought, all these years later, I know what that is. That's code for a crossover novel, one with a sort of dual cachet, both serious and commercial. And then I read all sort of teasers and the pulled quotes and the praise, and through all of that, I have to tell you that I felt in preponderance, extreme distance and sort of dispassion, as if I was looking at the cover and jacket of a book written by somebody else entirely. I mean, these were matters, the cover, the awards, the sales, that just seemed to have really, the truth has nothing to do with me. They seemed like somebody else's business. It wasn't until I got past the copyright page and looked at the dedication to my mother and father that I began to intersect with this novel in a personal way. And I have to say that when I looked at that dedication, I wondered about myself, because it seemed for a moment to kind of, I would say, an act of propriety, enacting a persona, putting myself forward in a particular way, announcing myself up front, potential readers, as a good son. But, hey, all these years later, who am I to judge? Perhaps I really was sincere. I can't remember. To tell you the truth, I don't even remember devising that dedication. But there it was, proof of something or other. I didn't have regrets about it. Was glad to see it. And then I turned to the acknowledgments, which come at the beginning of this book, and there's about 3 pages of them. And they read, benignly enough. I didn't see that the author was playing too many games there. But I also wasn't sure if the author was really entirely devoid of rhetorical intentions. But again, memory, the subtlety of one's machinations are lost with time. I indeed might have strategized deviously in my acknowledgments with a view towards establishing from the outset that here was an author who'd done boatloads of homework. I don't remember. I might have been thinking that way. And then I turned the next page to the dual epigrams, or two epigrams for this book. And the first one is well worn and familiar with, because it's the opening lines of Dante's The Divine Comedy. In the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself within a dark wood where the straight way was lost. How hard a thing it is to tell what a wild and rough and stubborn wood this was, which in my thought renews the fear. Well, in retrospect, after so many years, it didn't seem right. It sounded to me more appropriate to a sort of confessional midlife crisis tale, told at personal expense and with hard-won insight by an older but wiser first-person narrator. Didn't seem right for a courtroom drama about 30-somethings. I think at the time I did sense that something was amiss with this choice, but instead of deleting it, I just hedged my bets by adding another one. And this one is from a nonfiction book called Tuning the Rig by Harvey Oxenhorn. And the words are, harmony, like a following breeze at sea, is the exception. And that sounds even now better to me than the Dante, given its pithy and mellifluous directness, the maritime ambience of the novel, and most important, its thematic resonance. I have to tell you that I wish I'd gone solely with the Oxenhorn and dispensed with the Dante. I think it would have been stronger. Well, that brings me to line 1 of chapter 1, which is a line I had memorized for a long time, not because I intentionally and consciously set out to memorize it, but it happened via osmosis during multiple readings. I mean, how many times did I go back to the beginning of this novel and read myself forward in the name of immersing myself once again in order to make progress? And so this sentence played over and over in my head to the point where I knew it without looking at it. The accused man, Kabuo Miyamoto, sat proudly upright with a rigid grace, his palms placed softly on the defendant's table, the posture of a man who has detached himself insofar as this is possible at his own trial. Well, I don't remember where I found that name, Kabuo. But I do remember that a few years later I learned too late that it seemed wrong to people who knew their Japanese nomenclature. I knew, or at least I thought I knew, that this name meant pumpkin man, which must have put me in mind of a jack-o'-lantern's frozen, immobile face. I got curious when I picked up the book a couple of months ago about this name. I realized I had a great new tool at my disposal. I could put that name, Kabuo, in a search field and see what I got. So I did that. And I got about 10 pages in before I found a Kabuo that wasn't the Kabuo of Snow Falling on Cedars. So what does that tell you? But about 10 pages in, I found it as the surname of a woman in Texas. And then secondly, I found it as the surname of a woman in the Congo. And then third, I found it as the pseudonym of an online poker player. Well, I was still interested in this mistake I'd made. So I looked further and I found out that in Japanese, Kabuo means turnip. And this is something I didn't know was even possible. It means a male turnip. And then I wondered how I really ought to be pronouncing this name or this Japanese word. And so I used one of those online audio translators, and it was sort of vague and blurry and hard to understand, but I think it said kaboot, like that. Now, when I think about it, the people who made the movie must have done a lot more homework than me, because they changed the guy's name to something that people in Japan would recognize as legitimately a name. There's a certain irony to what they chose. They chose Kazuo, a common Japanese name, which means harmonious or peaceful man. So that's what they did in the movie, but in my book, sentence 1 of page 1, we have sitting here in the courtroom with this sort of rigidity, a male turnip. And not only a male turnip, but a male turnip who embodies a stereotype. Now, I know this, that I knew that at the time. I was thoroughly conscious when writing Snow Falling on Cedars of the stereotype that I was engaging. And I was writing it at a time that was concurrent with my decade as a high school English teacher, a public high school English teacher. And I was thoroughly engaged in the curricular culture wars of that era. And like my colleagues, I had a heightened awareness of tomes and lines that were politically incorrect, and I could ferret them out, even when they needed nudging to qualify. If at a hypothetical department meeting we'd gotten together to wrangle over Cabou's detachment, I probably would have argued for throwing this book on the trash heap of white male literature. But not before maybe haplessly pleading for the benefit of the doubt. I can hear myself. Iconic novels written by white Americans in this arena of race and fairness and prejudice are really legitimately subject to close scrutiny. In some of them, it's as if a blind person is asking us to see. Twain, for example, in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, offers a Jim who seems more than sometimes like a stock character from a minstrel show, while Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin is a font of pernicious stereotypes. In Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, black people rely on a white hero to move them forward, since they're utterly incapable of action themselves. This book was written after the Montgomery bus boycotts and after the long walk of the Little Rock Nine. Okay, here I am disparaging other authors with a kind of historical revisionism, but let me come to the point. The author of Snow Falling on Cedars is guilty too. Guilty of pursuing good intentions while wearing weak glasses. At times, my novel takes an interest in the insidious interior operations of stereotypes, in the ways that they're deployed with complexity by their victims, but elsewhere it suffers from insufficiencies of perception of the sort that white Americans, if they struggle with them at all, must struggle with lifelong. I referenced To Kill a Mockingbird, and I think that by now, probably a few thousand student papers have been launched toward Wherry High School teachers comparing To Kill a Mockingbird and Snow Falling on Cedars. That's a comparison that abounds elsewhere, and it's one that's been abetted by me. Now, Harold Bloom, the critic, very influential, prominent colossus of American criticism through the late 20th century, is apt in his description of To Kill a Mockingbird and of Snow Falling on Cedars as what he calls humane period pieces, and as defenses of human rights in an America where such rights continue to be thwarted. And I was pleased to hear Bloom put me in this category, and that I could share this space with Harper Lee seemed to me an honor. But then, as I read further in what's called Bloom's Guide to Snow Falling on Cedars, I found out that he wasn't really a great fan of either novel, mine or Harper Lee's. And then he spoke to me directly. He said that Guterson ought to listen to the Player King in Hamlet's The Mousetrap, who ends his great speech with a dark wisdom that goes like this: our wills and fates do so contrary run that our devices still are overthrown. Our thoughts are ours, their ends none of our own. Well, I read that, and it was Harold Bloom, and I felt duly chastened. And I've been pondering that, as well as Bloom's perfectly legitimate questions about my novel's ending. Does the heart's will exclude accident, and are our deepest desires so overdetermined that character becomes fate? Well, look, this is just the kind of raw material that leaves students and me sweating to make sense of it. But I am grateful to Bloom for engaging the novel in this vein and for asking the kinds of questions that reviewers rarely ask. Is it true that our wills and fates run contrary? Is it true that our thoughts are ours but their ends otherwise? Does the heart's will exclude accident? what is this truth of our condition that Hamlet understood and died from? Is character fate? These are all good questions. At the end of Snow Falling on Cedars, readers hear that the heart of any other, because it had a will, remains forever mysterious, and that accident rules every corner of the universe except the chambers of the human heart. This is really the last paragraph or so of the novel. Well, I have to say, ask myself, what does that mean? I mean, I'm the author, and I can't tell you. I really don't quite understand myself here, and to the degree that I do, I'm not sure I agree. I mean, doubt and perplexity as I reread this novel a couple of months ago simply abounded for me, and I have to tell you, that's really where I like to be. Answers are what leave me with a chill. There's really a little more frightening to me than a sure answer, especially when it's holding a gun or a pen. And the one thing I'm certain of is the peril of certainty. It can make of morality a violent disaster. It's blind, but it thinks no one else can see. And in the service of fiction, it's a danger. I can't tell you that I really know what John Gardner meant by moral fiction, even though he wrote at length on the subject. But I do know that whatever it is, it doesn't have dogma. It doesn't have lessons to impart. It doesn't have answers. It doesn't have claims. It doesn't have certainties. And I think it's probably written by people who know that they don't have the right to the final word. And out of respect for their own uncertainty, they are not about the business of trying to undo yours. I want to comment a little bit more on Bloom, a couple of his books. One is called How to Read and Why, which I think is a frightening title. And he argues for reading as a healing pleasure, one selfish rather than social, which is his way of saying that there is no sort of socially redeeming value in literature. It's really a personal pleasure that you take. It's a personal experience, and it is about healing oneself via pleasure. Okay. But then he goes on to say that if you really become what he calls an authentic reader, well then, the response to those labors that you undertake as a reader will eventually confirm you as an illumination to others, meaning you will grow in wisdom, and then you will grow in usefulness to your fellow human beings. I don't know, it sounds to me like he's having it both ways there. And I point this out not to disparage Bloom, but to move on to another point, which is that for me, cleaving the social good or cleaving politics from aesthetics it sounds impossible. I don't agree with Harold Bloom. If we were standing up here having a debate, he'd win, but I still wouldn't agree. He'd only win because he's smarter than I am. I don't see it. Cleaving politics from aesthetics. You might as well excise a person's heart and assert that they still live. I think the same thing goes for cleaving morality off from aesthetics. I mean, art for art's sake right there is a moral proposition. Even art that purports to be just art. Art that's a position as solidly entrenched in morality as Aesop's fables. I don't really understand the sort of embarrassment and squeamishness that you find in the creative classes when it comes to morality, the way it's pushed away. I don't understand why so many people in the arts and in literature conflate morality with moralizing. I think that sense of it is really small. I think it's even sort of froward, and I think it's logically specious. And I think it tells us to flee when we hear the word moral. But we can't flee, because no matter where we go, we find it still there, embedded in the fabric of our thought, feeling, and imagination. For me, asking if the novel as a genre has political and social efficacy, it's like asking if the Pope's Catholic, by which I mean the answer is obvious, and the question is really tired. A novel's value depends partly on stylistic accomplishment, the control of syntax, mastery of diction, skillful employment of convention. But in the end, for me, all of that is trumped. All of that's just a bag of tricks, a toolbox you can develop if you want to go to work on it. All of that's trumped by what one of my teachers called vision, by which she meant a credible and intrinsically sound sense of purpose, one not subject to decimation when challenged. It's not just about having this bag of tricks. Really, this question, why should novelists do what they do, ought to be a troubling one if you're a novelist. By the way, I'm going to be speaking tomorrow at Western on precisely that subject. Why should writers do what they do? Not just novelists, poets as well. It'd be a different talk entirely about the potential meaning of this act of creating stories and of writing poetry. Now, I can infer, looking back to the period in which I wrote Snow Falling on Cedars, that alongside that terrible ambition that I mentioned to you earlier, which I know was there, I remember that very, very clearly, the sense of being driven. I also had a profoundly strong will towards moral purpose. And I think I believe that somehow those two converged, that my ambition and my moral purpose were somehow the same thing. And that's just a way of telling you really how deluded I was at the time. In fact, when I went onto the stage to accept the Penn-Faulkner Award, I had written a talk that included these words. This was 1995, and smack in the middle of a decade of over-the-top American optimism. And I said, it's helpful for me to imagine humanity today allegorically as a small, weary tribe assailed on all sides by overwhelmingly troubling forces. It's winter, the people are cold and starving, many have died, others are sick. There's no food to be had, the days are dark, cruel enemies are closing in, the sun has set, the wind has come up, and the cries of children can be heard. In desperation, the tribe gathers around the warmth of a fire which will shortly go out, for there's little fuel to be had. And when the chiefs and spirit keepers are all done speaking and silence has fallen across the land, all will turn to the tribe's storyteller, not just to be swept away, transported out of troubled times by the sheer force of will towards told story, but more importantly because without stories that inspire those who hear them to carry on with the work of sustaining what is best in human beings, without stories, there's no tribe. Well, I can hear in my own voice where I was at the time, even in the way I'm delivering it now. It's considerably more lofty than it needs to be. It's somewhat histrionic. It's definitively hyperbolic. But actually, in substance, I don't really disagree with myself, or rather with who I was at the time. I mean, since then, everything and nothing has changed. And as for the future, I can imagine, as Bloom does in his Bloom's Guide to Snow Falling on Cedars, that there might someday, perhaps soon, be a third novel in this sequence that was begun by Harper Lee and has been continued by Snow Falling on Cedars, a novel that will deal with Arab Americans. This is Bloom speaking, I'm quoting him, that will deal with Arab Americans under suspicion in our age of terror. Well, when that book gets written, then the torch will duly be passed to another writer of a humane period piece. And in the meantime, really to my utter amazement, I find myself carrying it across the millennial divide as a gift that I don't necessarily deserve. Reading Snow Falling on Cedars of late, I have to tell you that I found it to be a very uneven performance as a novel. I mean, there were passages that now I would stand behind, but there were others that I'd overhaul or even toss. The pace of the novel for me was not so much stately, as I had heard some critics say, but frustrating. And that was something actually I came to count among its redeeming qualities. The pages turn, but the readers, or at least this reader, is mad at them. And then as they dwindle, the reader wants more. The narrative voice is omniscient, distant, old-fashioned, inert, poetic, and romantic, and with something in it conspicuously held back. It maintains its dispassion while sounding a note of mystery and while intimating something assiduously unarticulated. This is a narrator who doesn't make a fool of himself being flashy, but on the other hand, he's utterly risk-averse. and he plays it straight at times to his detriment, refusing to take on a personal color even while he's waxing romantic over beach stones and seafoam. Hiding his face, looming invisibly, he reveals himself as philosophical and private as someone engaged at a brooding remove. In short, someone like Ishmael Chambers, who dislikes people, but at least ostensibly, as the novel tells us, loves humanity. The arc of this novel, my novel, the arc of my novel suffers from predictability. Reading it, I grew tired of each witness on the stand as yet more novelistic fodder. There were moments when the author didn't do enough to cloak his clanking machinery. I'm really not proud of the handoff of reminiscence as the segue from chapter 7 to 8. You can go look at that so if you want. And I'm not proud of the bald, flagrant way I made characters remember what I needed them to remember on schedule. On the other hand, I sometimes found myself turning these pages with an interest in what would happen next. And that's unusual for me because I stopped reading novels dependent on plot a long time ago because this causing that and this leading to this had become sort of a peripheral interest to me as a reader. Snow Falling on Cedars is nothing if not plot-driven, but I don't really think that's doing it a lot of harm, except at the end. I can see that I probably rushed the last chapter, working dutifully to fulfill the requirements of climax and denouement. And this novel then finally comes up against the author's insufficiencies, and it splutters to a halt in a blaze of abstractions. I took the easy way out, poetry and profundity. Well, thinking again about that, or looking again, digging again into that box of notes I mentioned earlier that I found in my basement, I found that there was a time when I thought the name Miyamoto should have been Omoto, and that Kabuo should have met Karl Heine on the water with a lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other. I thought that maybe this story should open on Pearl Harbor Day. At one point, I thought that Ishmael should have 2 older brothers. At one point, I thought it would be best to begin in the 80s with a first-person narrator who's a historical sleuth. At one point, I thought this novel would be best without a trial. At one point, I thought its title should be Discord. But Discord pretty quickly seemed wrong to me. And as I paged through these notes in the box, I found that I had had a dialogue with my editor about the title, and at one point she had suggested the Cedars of San Pedro, and I had written her back to say that sounded to me like a bad golf course in Spain. And we went back and forth with this sort of, except for me being horribly blunt once in a while, a lot of judicious tiptoeing about our feelings and heading through this sort of polite process. And she essayed at one point that because I was in so many hearts and minds in this novel that the book lacked an emotional center, and I just countered by saying that, you know, this breath of omniscience is really necessary to a book whose primary theme is communal responsibility. She then wrote back to tell me that my prose style was wooden, and because I didn't want to rock the boat too much, I just agreed and told her I'd try to change it. And she wondered if I'd overdone it with too many flashbacks, and I said, no, I think this story depends on an accounting of the past as it relates to present circumstances, and so we muddled our way forward together. She left what was then Harcourt Brace and went on to Norton, and I have enormous respect for her as a person and as an editor, and I think we would laugh together. She's younger than I am, and the two of us were young, and we muddled our way, and I've been in touch with her since, and I'd love to work with her again on a book because she's a truly brilliant editor. I don't at all mean to disparage her. Well, another thing that happened to me reading of late, I ended up liking the snow in this novel, except when the author made a snowball out of it and flung it in my face while yelling, "Symbol!" And that happened a lot. On the other hand, I found that, or I thought I hadn't written too badly about war, And that kind of impressed me because war is really hard to write about. I also found that far too many pages of this novel just seemed sort of goaded by research. And the notes in my box corroborated my research neurosis, my obsession. I found a summary of guidelines for the preservation of toxicologic evidence. I found a précis of pages on mechanical injuries of brain and meninges. Research, I think, became a sort of end in itself for me. And in the struggle that any writer has with blank pages, my research became a sort of first and last resort. I simply fell back on it when my imagination paled, and when the research didn't give way, I just piled up more. And I see that in the novel. What am I doing up here? Lambasting myself. Reading my own novel made me really self-conscious. It's a strange experience. Starting right from the epigrams that I mentioned earlier, I felt determined to be critical. I wanted to feel better all these years later than Snow Falling on Cedars, superior to its simplicities, older, wiser, less certain, and improved. Well, I have to tell you that posturing in front of myself that way made reading pretty hard. But I still tried to pay attention to what was actually on the page. And what I found there was conviction and sincerity, which taken together as a kind of sensibility seemed to me to miss a lot. I really couldn't find life as it is. The people in this novel seemed troubled, but not authentically. And meanwhile, there was a sort of relentless conventionality that informed everything. One way to put this was that I was reading a very straightforward and plain-speaking story about which I might just as readily say that it played no tricks, and it didn't point toward its author. And I guess summarizing this, for all the ways in which Snow Falling on Cedars struck me as immature, it also struck me as the opposite. Short on view, it was focused and humane. It offered tempered hope. It acknowledged our existential distress without succumbing to it. It was riddled with shortcomings, but it wasn't in the world just to glorify itself. If a book was a person, Snow Falling on Cedars would be a white guy in his 20s, so full of idealism that even blind he does some good. In the end, I can't really dislike him. He keeps winding up and throwing with unabated energy, puncturing small holes in the edifice of entropy, as if the second law of thermodynamics didn't predict the heat death of the universe. There are worse ways to be than that. Now, to tell you the truth, 20 years later, I continue to be astonished by this novel. Snow Falling on Cedars is a novel with cliff notes. Essays about it are free online, or you can download them for a price. Barnes & Noble sells Snow Falling on Cedars lesson plan in its Nookbook format, offering, among other things, 20 fun activities. And Snow Falling on Cedars has not become as resonant as, say, Catch-22, but it's so widely in use as to simply astonish and embarrass me. It's become legitimate provender for that television show called Jeopardy! On occasion, it fills out nicely a crossword puzzle. It lends itself to public wordplay. It has a modest life in cartoon drawings and community theaters, as a photo caption, as fodder for high school video projects. But the most wonderful thing all about it is it's taken a very prominent place among banned books. If you want to buy a simplified version of my book, you can do that, in which case you won't have to put up with my overwriting. You can read it in Mandarin, you can read it in Hungarian, you can read it in Finnish, you can read it in dozens of languages. I also find that after 20 years, for better or for worse, that Snow Falling on Cedars is my identity. And that when I meet people, they say, "You're the author of Snow Falling on Cedars," and I say, "Yes." Yeah. I'm the author of that book, first and foremost that. I found that here and there in the world, I'm I'm celebrated for raising awareness of the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and I've found that elsewhere I'm castigated for perpetuating stereotypes and for being exactly the kind of white guy, maybe even the avatar of this kind of white guy who can't write about race without a white hero front and center. I think both parties make credible and valid points. I've also found that in the wake of snow falling on Cedars, all of my other novels written since have just been inundated by its enduring presence. Those other novels have disappeared under banks of snow and are only now and then dug up and thawed out. Now, the answer to the question, which I get sometimes, how do you feel about snow falling on Cedars? I don't have one answer. I have a list. And first of all, I feel like its father. I've shepherded this child into the world, and it's grown and gone off on its own and become itself and done what it's done, and I've watched it with perplexing, I've been perplexed and I've admired it as well, the way you might feel about a child. I also feel, and you can hear this in my voice tonight, like the book's worst enemy. I feel like its high priest a lot of the time when I get up to speak, and I have to say I feel enormously that I'm its beneficiary in so many ways. And sometimes I feel the way you might feel about a house you used to live in. That is a sort of nostalgia for the book. I don't wear it as a hair shirt, even though that's possible, and I don't fly it like a Learjet, and I know that's possible. I've seen writers do that. It's not a millstone, it's not an albatross around my neck. The one thing I really know about it is it's completely out of my control, and maybe it was never in my control. And I can tell you that at this very moment, I can sense out there that novel agitating 16-year-olds with papers due tomorrow. Papers on young love, or war, or prejudice, or justice. And that reminds me of something that I think I remember correctly, which is that's exactly what I had in mind when Snow Falling in Cedars was nothing other than notes in a teacher's desk drawer. And that in the end, I think I wrote this novel for them. Tomorrow I'm going to be at Linden High School talking to high school kids, and I think I'll be in exactly the right place with regard to this novel. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.